The Thanksgiving table was glowing under soft yellow lights when the air around me suddenly turned sharp. The clatter of silverware, the scent of roasted turkey, the warmth of the room, all of it seemed to fall away as a careless remark from across the table struck harder than anyone realized. For a moment, I sat frozen, feeling something in me splinter in complete silence. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people you love, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Stories like this unfold far more quietly than they should. I remember staring at my hands, realizing they only saw what I provided, not who I was. I didn't know it yet, but that quiet breaking point was about to change everything. Let me show you how it all began. I remember the exact moment something inside me finally gave way. It happened right there at the Thanksgiving table, with the smell of roasted turkey still hanging in the air and the soft clatter of silverware around me. One careless remark from my daughter sliced through the room and settled on my chest like a weight I could no longer carry. In that instant, I felt myself pull back, almost as if I were watching the scene from somewhere outside my own body. It was the clarity that startled me most. I saw, with painful precision, how my children no longer viewed me as their mother, but as a dependable source of money, a safety net they felt entitled to. The realization burned more sharply than their words ever could. I stayed quiet, letting the conversation flow on without me. But inside, something shifted. I knew I couldn't keep playing this role. Not anymore. I felt a steady resolve form beneath the hurt, calm and unmistakable. By the time I reached for my phone beneath the table, that decision was already made. And maybe, before I tell you what happened next, I should explain how things ever got this far. Losing my husband Charles left a silence in my life I never quite learned how to fill. The house felt too big, the nights felt too long, and even the simple routines we once shared became reminders of how abruptly everything had changed. In those first months, I tried to hold myself together by staying busy, telling myself that keeping life moving would somehow keep the grief from swallowing me whole. But grief has a way of finding you, even in the quietest corners. What surprised me most was how quickly I clung to any sense of purpose I could find. When my children called with worries or small crises, I felt needed again. Offering help, especially financial help, felt like a way to stay connected, like a bridge back to the family life I feared I was losing. I convinced myself it was temporary, that I was simply stepping in until they steadied themselves. Every time I wrote a check or transferred a little money, it eased the ache of the empty chair across the table. I didn't notice how easily simple support blurred into habit, how quickly habit became expectation. I told myself I was keeping the family stitched together, even if it meant stretching myself thin. Looking back, I can see how vulnerable I was, how much I wanted to feel valued, and maybe that's why the early requests seemed harmless at first, almost comforting. But that was only the beginning of how things slowly shifted. In the beginning, everything felt natural, even loving. When my son called about an unexpected car repair, I stepped in without thinking twice. It felt good to ease his burden. A few weeks later, my daughter mentioned she was short on rent, and I told myself it was just one of those unpredictable months young adults go through. I didn't see any harm in offering a little help. But slowly, the tone of those moments changed. The emergencies became more frequent, and the reasons grew softer around the edges. Suddenly, a forgotten bill, a weekend trip gone over budget, or a late fee from simple carelessness all seemed to find their way back to me. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that they were just overwhelmed, that I was only smoothing out a few rough patches. With each request, I felt a tug between what I could manage and what I convinced myself a good mother should do. I swallowed my discomfort because it felt easier than disappointing them. And in the quiet moments afterward, I reminded myself that helping my children was a way to stay close, even if it meant cutting back on small comforts for myself. Still, I couldn't ignore the subtle shift in their voices, the way their gratitude became quieter while their expectations grew louder. The first red flag was how they stopped asking if it was a good time. They simply assumed I would take care of it. I remember feeling a faint ache in my chest the night I realized they no longer hesitated before leaning on me. At the time, I kept pushing those feelings aside, but looking back, those early signs were the beginning of something much heavier, something I didn't see clearly until it had already taken root. The shift happened so gradually that I didn't recognize it until I was already buried under it. What began as the occasional rescue slowly turned into larger, heavier obligations. My son mentioned falling behind on his credit cards, and without thinking, I covered the balance. My daughter hinted at wanting to move into a nicer apartment, and somehow I found myself helping with the deposit. Each time, I told myself it was a one-time thing, that they were just having a rough season. But the rough season never ended. The requests only grew. What unsettled me most was how casually they treated these moments. The word loan slipped into conversations as though repayment were implied, yet it never came. Months passed, and the money simply disappeared from my accounts, becoming another silent gift they never acknowledged again. I tried not to dwell on it. I kept telling myself a mother's job was to support her children, even when it stretched her thin. But the stretch became a strain. I began cutting back on groceries, delaying my own appointments, letting small home repairs slide because I didn't want to dip further into savings. Meanwhile, I couldn't ignore the way their lives seemed to glide upward. New gadgets, upgraded cars, weekend getaways, little glimpses that made me pause. They appeared comfortable, even thriving, while I quietly trimmed pieces of my life to keep up with their expectations. The breaking moment came one evening when I sat down with my banking statement spread across the dining table. For the first time, I added it all up. The total stunned me. I stared at the number, feeling the air leave my chest. I had given away more than I ever realized, more than I could reasonably afford. And the worst part was knowing they hadn't even noticed the cost to me. A heaviness settled over me then, something that wouldn't lift. I pushed through those weeks with a growing knot in my stomach, feeling the imbalance harden into something undeniable. By the time Thanksgiving approached, all those unspoken years of strain were pressing at the surface, waiting for the smallest spark to ignite. I walked into Thanksgiving holding on to a small, fragile hope that we might finally speak honestly. I had rehearsed gentle words in my mind during the drive over, telling myself that a simple conversation about boundaries and repayment wasn't unreasonable. I wanted clarity. Not conflict. I wanted to feel heard. But even before dinner began, I sensed a familiar chill. The way my son barely looked up, the quick glance my daughter exchanged with him, the little sighs that told me my presence felt like an inconvenience. Still, I tried. I eased into the topic as carefully as I could, hoping they would meet me halfway. Instead, I felt the air shift. Their faces hardened with irritation, as if I were bringing up something ridiculous. The more I tried to share how overwhelmed I'd been, the more they brushed it off, treating my concerns like some exaggerated worry of an older woman who didn't understand how the world worked. And then came the moment that broke something inside me, a quiet snicker, a dismissive comment thrown out casually, and the unmistakable sense that they saw me as nothing more than a walking wallet who had suddenly forgotten her place. The humiliation washed over me in a slow, burning wave. I sat there, my hands resting in my lap, feeling myself shrink while they carried on without me. It wasn't anger that filled me first. It was grief. A grief so sharp I could barely swallow. That was when clarity settled in. I realized that to them, my needs were secondary, almost invisible. So I fell silent. I let the conversation move past me as though I wasn't there. But inside, a quiet resolve began to form, steady and unshakable. By the time dessert was served, I knew that when I left that table, everything was going to change. When I drove home after Thanksgiving, I felt an unusual stillness settle over me. It wasn't sadness or anger anymore. It was clarity. I walked into the house, set my purse down, and opened my laptop with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. One by one, I froze every account my children had access to. I changed passwords, removed their names, and took back control of the money I had been handing out so freely. It felt almost ceremonial, like I was closing a chapter that had been draining me in ways I never fully admitted. By the next morning, the messages started. First curious, then confused, then panicked. They couldn't withdraw anything. Transfers were declined. Their bills bounced. I watched the notifications roll in, missed calls, long voicemails, frantic texts, each one revealing just how heavily they had come to rely on me. Yet for the first time, I didn't feel pulled toward fixing anything. I felt steady, grounded, almost peaceful. Later that week, they began showing up at my door. Their faces moved through stages: bewilderment, irritation, anger, and finally the familiar guilt they used to tug at me with. But standing there, listening to them insist that I was overreacting, I realized how differently I felt inside. Their panic no longer dictated my actions. Their frustration no longer shook me. I let them speak, let their emotions rise and fall, but I didn't budge. I kept my voice calm, my resolve firm, my boundaries intact. For the first time in a long time, I chose myself. What I didn't know then was that this decision, this single act of reclaiming my life, would unravel truths I had been avoiding for years, truths tied to grief, history, and the things I had buried deep. After Charles passed, I never truly faced the life he left behind. I moved through those early years in a fog, doing only what was necessary to keep the house running. Anything beyond that, especially our finances, felt too heavy to touch. His handwriting on old statements, his notes in the margins, even the familiar folder edges softened by his hands were reminders I couldn't bear to confront. So I pushed it all aside, telling myself I would deal with it when I felt stronger. But after cutting the kids off, something in me finally shifted. I pulled out the boxes I had avoided for so long and spread everything across the dining table. As I sorted through statements, I noticed charges that didn't make sense, withdrawals made during months when I could barely get myself out of bed. My heart sank with the quiet realization that one of my children had taken advantage of that fog, slipping into my accounts when I wasn't aware enough to notice. The hurt that followed wasn't fiery. It was slow and heavy, settling into the same place inside me where I had carried the grief of losing Charles, and remembering him, his worry about leaving me alone, his pride that kept him from asking our kids for help, made the whole picture sharper. I saw how lonely I had been, how much I had wanted to feel connected, and how easily that longing made me overlook what was happening. That night, sitting among the papers, I realized I couldn't handle this alone anymore. It was time to take formal steps, even if it meant facing truths I never wanted to see. Reaching out to an attorney was something I never imagined myself doing, but after everything I uncovered, it felt like the only responsible path left. Sitting in that office, listening as he laid out my options, I felt a kind of validation I hadn't realized I needed. He told me I wasn't overreacting, that what had happened to me was real, documented, and legally actionable. For the first time in years, I felt the ground under my feet again. When the demand letters went out, the fallout was immediate. My children spiraled in every direction: panic, outrage, disbelief. They flooded me with messages, each one trying a different angle. One moment they played the victims, claiming I was abandoning them. The next, they suggested I must be confused or unwell. It was strange witnessing their unraveling from such a calm place inside myself. I felt almost detached, not out of coldness, but because I finally understood that their reactions weren't my responsibility anymore. The family meeting they insisted on became a turning point of its own. They gathered in my living room, tense and defensive, expecting me to fold the way I always had. Instead, I listened quietly, letting their words wash past me. And when they realized my calm wasn't wavering, something shifted. Their confidence cracked. Their fear grew more honest. They understood I wasn't backing down. In the end, the attorney drafted a repayment plan with clear timelines and consequences. Wage garnishment was on the table if they chose to ignore it. Seeing it all in writing gave me a sense of justice I hadn't believed I would ever feel. Still, even as that chapter settled, I sensed there were deeper truths waiting beneath the surface, truths I had yet to uncover. While gathering documents for the attorney, I stumbled across a thin envelope tucked behind an old insurance file. Inside was a statement for an account I had never seen before, holding far more than I ever expected Charles could have saved. My breath caught as I pieced together what it meant. He had set this aside quietly, during those years when his health was failing and he worried about leaving me unprotected. I could almost feel his presence in that moment, his pride, his fear, his stubborn desire to shield me even when he couldn't say it aloud. The discovery hit me with a mix of grief and comfort. All this time, I had believed I was standing alone, yet here was proof that he had been trying to take care of me in the only way he knew how, and it cast an even harsher light on how differently our children had treated me. That truth settled into my heart as I stepped into the next chapter of rebuilding my life. Rebuilding my life after everything felt quieter than I expected, but also more meaningful. I started creating small routines that belonged only to me. Morning walks, evenings with a book, weekend classes at the community center. For the first time in years, my days were shaped by choice rather than obligation. My home felt lighter, calmer, almost like it was finally mine again. My children eventually adjusted to the new boundaries. Our conversations became more balanced, rooted in respect instead of expectation. They began showing up with emotional support rather than open hands, and I learned to accept their presence without fear of being drained. It wasn't perfect, but it was healthier, and it allowed me to feel like their mother again instead of a resource. Through it all, I felt a steady pride growing inside me, proof that I could rebuild, that I could reclaim my voice and my life. And with that clarity came one final lesson I knew I needed to share. Choosing myself taught me that love without boundaries becomes a burden no one can carry. I learned that respect grows only when we protect our own worth. If you've ever had to reclaim your voice or set hard limits, share your story below. I read every comment and I'd love to hear yours.